We've got a great interview for you guys today. We have found the last Rockefeller Republican. In his case, literally. It's Dave Spencer. He's here in the studio with me, and he's the founder of Practically Republican, and he is the grandson of John D. Rockefeller III and nephew of former Senator Jay Rockefeller, who was actually a Democrat. Now, Dave, it's great to have you here. You got a long resume, MBA from Stanford, BayKids, nonprofit organization that serves children through self-empowerment programs. You're on the executive committee of the California Republican Party. But mainly I want to talk about Practically Republican, and is it possible to be a moderate Republican anymore? So in that light, let me read the stated objective of Practically Republican, and then we'll take that as a base.
Sure.
It says to engage, organize, and motivate a new kind of GOP supporter, one who is fact and issue-oriented and invites conversation, respects differences of opinion, believes in compromise, and puts sound policy before partisanship. So I read that and I think that, well, that makes sense, Dave. That's a good and worthy goal. But the immediate question I have is, why bother?
Well, I think you have to look at it from two ways. That a lot of the current voters are very set in their ways. And I think the key to the success of an organization like Practically Republican is engaging future voters. That's why we've teamed up with No Labels, for example, which is a great organization. And we're going to a symposium in New Hampshire in October where they'll have students from hundreds of colleges. Because I think engaging the next generation, which the country has been, even though it's funny, the politics of the country have been moving slightly to the right in terms of policy, but the country, in terms of their views, has been moving slightly to the left. So
I would say significantly to the left.
Yeah, and so what we're trying to do is just make sure people are informed, because particularly in the presidential election, the turnout is 60% if we're lucky, and last year's midterms it was 34%, which is abysmal.
Yeah.
And so if people don't participate in the process and they don't care, then it gives politicians a chance to be a lot more irresponsible and a lot less accountable.
So those are all the right and decent answers. But I ask why bother in two lights.
Okay.
One is, if I was a Rockefeller, I probably wouldn't do anything. I'm kidding, but we'll get back to that. We'll talk about that a little bit. But more importantly, why bother trying to reform the Republican Party? Why not just be a Democrat? And you understand that you've got issues because this is you're unique and interesting because you're trying to be a reasonable Republican, which then makes you wonder why you're in the party.
Yeah, well, I think that it's an interesting question, and part of it is because it's a passion of mine, and I don't have any ulterior motives. I'm not running for anything. I'm not trying to make money. I don't need the money. But I think part of it is that there are a lot of people that are not engaged in the process, and I think that what we're trying to do is make it more of a ground up as opposed to a top-down organization. So to get people more interested, and then that will make them participate more. And we've chosen really 4 issues that we call our pillars of pragmatism, 2 of which everyone agrees with, and 2 of which, if the party doesn't address, we're going to be nationally irrelevant for 40 years. Tax reform and campaign finance reform, I think everyone would agree, is something that needs to be addressed. And then climate change and immigration are issues that will become more and more important, particularly when you look again at the demographics. And that, my favorite stat is if you look at 1988 and 2012, Mitt Romney and George H.W. Bush got exactly the same percentage of the white vote, which was almost 60%. The difference was George H.W. Bush got 426 electoral votes and Mitt Romney got 206. This election, because again, every month, 25 to 50,000 Latinos become eligible to vote. So it'll be 28 million this year, which is 11% of the population. So this year, to match last year, they would have to get 65% of the white vote, which was only done when Ronald Reagan won 49 states in 1984. So, as Lindsey Graham said, we're just not minting enough angry white guys to stay in business.
Okay, so I get all that,
Yeah.
and Trump isn't going to make your job any easier, right?
No, he is not.
He just threw a grenade in your tent by making your chance of getting a Republican president, given that demographic hurdle, I don't want to say nearly impossible, that's too strong, but really, really hard, right? Okay, but again, what makes you a Republican? Because, okay, if you're open to reasonable immigration policies, well, that's the Democratic position. If you're open to...
Not for everyone, but...
Okay, so let's get into those distinctions in a second, right? If you're open to campaign finance reform, now there's a lot of great Republicans that fight for that on the local and state level, but not a lot on the national level. So what makes you a Republican? What do you like about the Republican Party?
Well, because what the Republican Party has traditionally stood for, in my opinion, has been abandoned. And that was being pragmatic, that was being fiscally conservative, that was being not necessarily socially liberal, but not wearing it on your sleeve, not talking about no exceptions for rape or incest and abortion and defunding Planned Parenthood, which increases abortions, by the way. So it's part of it is the pragmatism, and our motto is let's talk. So we're trying to engage people because I think all you hear now is what people disagree on, right? And there's a lot of things that people agree on if they talk. And the chapter from my book, which is called Practically Republican, which you can get on the website, download it for free, of course, practicallyrepublican.com. The last chapter is Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and it's almost like an old-fashioned thing when you're setting people up. And you have Michael Bloomberg in the middle, then you have conservatives on either side, and you sit them, conservative, liberal. Then you ask them some innocuous questions. Where are you from? How many kids? And then you ask, what do you think? What do we agree on? And just to give you a classic example, I don't agree with Ted Cruz on practically anything. But what
bless your heart.
But what he wants to do on campaign finance reform is exactly what we suggest, and that is.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So we suggest that, campaign money really is like water that goes downhill. And part of, I think, in being a responsible political person is admitting when you're wrong. And I supported McCain-Feingold, and that was a mistake because that started the process, which the dreadful Citizens United completed, of transferring the distribution power from the party to the individual. And parties, because they're big tents, have to look out for more interest. Whereas the Sheldon Adelsons and the Koch brothers or the Steyers of the world, they're looking out for their specific interests. And so it's made it much more extreme and much more partisan. So I think there should be no limits and 100% disclosure, because I feel like many people do. It's the anonymity that bothers me more than the amount. And I think a lot of it would drown itself out because so much money would come into the system. And if someone gives a gazillion to a candidate, you'd be able to know. Then down the road, if all of a sudden President whoever does a favor for someone, you're like, wait, why did they do that? And you can look back and see, they gave him $3 million.
Okay, so that partly explains why you're a Republican. That's a perfectly fine position to have. I totally disagree, by the way.
Okay.
And the reason is, of course, I'm for disclosure. We should at least know who's giving the bribes to the politicians. But in reality, they're not giving it out of the goodness of their hearts. There might be a couple of guys who care about one particular issue. Look, let's be fair on both sides. Steyers cares about climate change. I think it's genuine. Right. Adelson cares about Israel, and I think it's genuine. He also cares about crushing unions and et cetera, and that's for financial reasons.
Paying 9% taxes and all the fun stuff he does.
Right. But most of it is they're businessmen, and they're giving a bribe, and they are going to demand a return on their money. And we don't know all of them, but we know some of them, and it doesn't stop them at all. We know that it's the Koch brothers, and they're like, we're going to gather up a whole bunch of people. We're going to give $900 million. We're going to buy all your politicians, and there's not a goddamn thing you can do about it.
But right now, the whole super PAC thing is obviously a joke, because this thing about they can't communicate with the candidates. I'm going to play golf with them, but don't worry, we're not going to talk about our super PAC.
Yeah.
So that's a crock.
Right.
But I think that if you look at the fact that individuals in general are still limited to $2,700, or in San Francisco it's even $500, whatever. So I think if everybody had unlimited amounts to give, a lot of it would cancel each other out. So you'd have less in the system.
I don't think it would, and I'll tell you why. So two reasons. One, the overwhelming majority of people don't have any money to give. So their voices get drowned out, and it becomes a battle of the rich. So yes, there's some liberal rich who could counteract the conservative rich, but they do it not for financial remuneration. And if you have a financial incentive to give to politicians, well, you'll give more. It's just logic. It's pure incentives, disincentives, right? So if I give $10 million and I get a tax break worth $100 million, I'm going to keep doing that. If I give $10 million because I really care about helping inner city kids, well, I don't have a financial incentive to do that. I might do that out of the goodness of my heart, and I might continue that. Eventually, the people who have a financial incentive will drown out the people who don't, and they'll run the place. And that's basically what's happened.
Well, I think we'll agree to disagree on that one, because I think, again, that there are very few people who can give 9-figure checks, but there are a lot of people who can give 6-figure checks. And that would add up, because right now it's the individuals that are hamstrung. Corporations and PACs can give what they want. So I'm saying at least make it a level playing field, empower the individuals, and then you have the disclosure, because we've tried so many times to limit campaign finance and it just hasn't worked. So after a while, as I say, you have to acknowledge it's like water going downhill. You can dam it up, but it's not going to. In the end, it's going to get where it goes. But in any case, I think that's where people agree. And there are a lot of other issues that, for example, if you ask people about the minimum wage, more than 53% of Republicans think we should raise the minimum wage. If you ask about asking the working class people, but also the rich, to help subsidize Social Security, like 70% of Republicans agree with that. So again, if we focused on the things that we agreed upon, and then we could start to build up a modicum of trust, because right now there's so much, and particularly since Newt Gingrich, when the whole demonizing thing started. So it's not just your ideas are bad, but you're bad. And so it's so personal that let's try to, and tax reform, for example, is something everyone agrees the system is broken. People work to maximize the tax system, not to maximize productivity, which makes the economy less efficient. What we suggest to practically Republican is that you have to do two things. First of all, you have to have revenue neutrality, which is what Reagan said in 1986 when they did it. That way no one's raising or lowering taxes. Then I would suggest doing what they did when they closed all those military bases, which is, talk about pork, is they set up a bipartisan commission that made recommendations, and then everyone in Congress was allowed an up or down vote. No riders, no amendments, and most important, no lobbyists, because nothing kicks the hornet's nest of lobbyists more than tax reform. And we can get into more detailed conversation, but I think just to give you an idea, the four biggest write-offs are employer deductibility of health care, mortgage interest, charitable giving, state and local taxes. And I think you can make a very convincing argument to get rid of all of those. I'm a philanthropist, for example, but the charitable giving in this country has remained remarkably constant at 2% of GDP, despite a tax rate in the last 65 years that has gone as high as 91% and as low as 28%. So people will give because they want to give, and a third of the organizations are bogus. You can get a write-off by giving to the Church of Scientology.
Yeah, well, again, we agree on that. So, look, I think you're a reasonable guy, and we definitely have disagreements. I also disagree on taxes in a lot of ways, which I can outline in a second. But Dave, I keep coming back to the money in politics, and I'll tell you why. Because the central question you're asking is, how come we agree on these things, but they're not getting done? Because there's a majority of Republicans who are in favor of things that progressives agree with, that you just outlined. And it's because the politicians are paid not to agree. So it's all fine and good. Yeah, of course, it's a tough. Well, I just did a story about gun violence today where over 70% of NRA members say, for God's sake, get a decent federal background check, right? Over 80% of gun owners say that. Over 90% of Americans say that, right? And we can't get it because the politicians get their paychecks, not paychecks, but donor checks from the NRA. And we know it, and we know their names, and they're out in the open. So that's why we're never gonna get agreement. So you go to the Republicans and a lot of Democrats, Schumer, et cetera, right? So this is not like Democrats are angels.
Schumer was the one who blocked the closing of the hedge fund loophole, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
For which I will never forgive him.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right about that, and you know, when it comes to money corrupting politics, Schumer's near the top of the list as well, right?
Yeah.
But the Republican Party has really professionalized this, okay? And so when you go to have a reasonable conversation, you keep getting surprised why they won't, because they get paid not to have a reasonable conversation.
That's true in some cases, but the background checks is a perfect example. I actually blame President Obama more.
Jesus,
than,
why?
I'll explain. First of all, the NRA, I think, is somewhat of a paper tiger. They have a $300 million total budget. They gave $20 million to campaigns. In 2012, their success rate was about 1%. So the NRA relies more on their reputation of scaring people than their financial clout. So I think if people had more courage to stand up to the NRA, that their power would be much lessened. But that's a side issue. But there were 4 votes short on that background checks bill. And someone like Pat Toomey, who will probably get reelected in Pennsylvania as senator because he had the guts to stand up as a Republican and co-sponsor the background check bill with Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who's also a gun guy. And Obama's, I think, one of his biggest weaknesses is he hates to do what one of the most important tasks of a president is. And that is to sometimes to swallow your pride, to go up to Capitol Hill and say, look, I need your help on this, all right? Two examples of people who voted against it, all right? Heidi Heitkamp was the new senator from North Carolina, right? 85% of people, North Dakota, 85% of the people in her state wanted the bill passed. But she got calls from the Gun Club of America and from the NRA. Obama should have gone into her and say, look, you're a new senator. I need your help on this, or I'm going to make your life miserable for 6 years. Okay?
So agree and disagree.
Mark Begich from Alaska, he had asked for a favor from the Interior Department. He votes against the bill, and they still do the favor. What do you think LBJ would have done? He would have, what's off.
Yeah. Okay. So the part I agree with you on, Dave, is that yes, Obama is very reluctant to go to Democrats and say there will be a price to pay. You cross me at your peril, right?
And to go to Republicans and say, look, politics, when push comes to shove, is a transactional business, in my view. And sometimes you need to go, and he did this, thank God, on the trade bill, which is why it passed, because he was thinking more, I think, of his legacy. But you also need to go to Republicans, people you disagree with, and you say, look, you help me on this. I know there's a bill down the road that you need support on. I'll help you on that. That's what someone like LBJ was a master of.
Yeah, but I think that we're looking at this. The part I disagree with you is that that's an antiquated way of looking at it. Because back in LBJ's days, the Supreme Court had not yet decided Buckley v. Vallejo, Bellotti, that allowed corporations and the ultra-rich to give, in essence, unlimited money through super PACs, through other things. Citizens United put it on steroids. But they had already said corporations can give money to politicians. From then on, we were toast. So now when Obama goes to those people and he tries to put pressure on them, he has some tools in his arsenal. And I wish he would use those tools more. But at the end of the day, they go, yeah, that's really interesting, Mr. President. But the lobbyists have much more control over those politicians than the president does. So they go, yeah, that's like your opinion, man. And we can go play golf, but that guy writes my checks. But that guy decides whether I get elected or don't get elected. 19 out of 20 times in Congress, the guy with more money wins. Not dependent on Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative. Whoever has more money wins 95% of the time. So they can say to the president, very pleasant having tea and crumpets with you, but I'm still going to vote with the guy that signs my checks.
But Cenk, the one thing you're forgetting is money is the second most important criterion in what politicians want. Votes is number one. And that's when Larry David's ex-wife gave all this money to Tom Daschle when he was running for re-election, and he didn't carry out what she wanted to do because the people in his state didn't want it. So I think that a lot of times...
But what does the money buy, though, Dave? The money buys ads to deceive people.
But the point is, if there's legislation that is good for your state, and it's something that is not going to pass without the president's support, or the president might veto it, that's where you use the power. Because then you appeal to getting reelected is the primary motivation of politicians. Not raising money. Raising money helps them. But still, getting reelected is the number one thing that they want to do. And making people in their state happy is the best way to
No way.
to do that.
Tricking
The money
people in their state through ads, pretending that they did their bidding while doing the bidding of the donors, is the most efficient and practical way of getting reelected.
But that's assuming that they don't actually come through with legislation. Okay,
No, but the legislation is irrelevant, and I can prove it. Princeton did a study. They studied 20 years, 1,800 different policy positions. Public opinion had zero effect on public policy. What had a direct correlation was special interest and donor opinion.
Right, I'm not talking about public opinion.
You can pass the laws that your state hates, and the people in that state hate. The Republicans hate it, the Democrats hate it. You'll still win if you have more money because you'll buy ads that'll say, I was on your side. Yeah, me.
Yeah.
And the other guy doesn't have a megaphone and you crush him.
But, but in some ways, we're talking about apples and oranges here because, again, you're talking about public opinion. And I'm saying there's certain things, for example, like, certain states like subsidies, certain states want agricultural breaks. Those are the kind of things, those policies that politicians can come home and say, well, this guy may raise more money and he's running negative ads, but I've got this bill passed, I got that bill passed, I got that bill passed.
How are you going to do it if you don't have money? You won't have the ads to be able to tell people.
But the point is, that's what the way politics used to work, and I think that what has made that less effective. It's partially money, but it's partially that nobody talks to each other anymore. Okay, these guys used to be roommates. I mean, the best example is go to the Senate dining room right now. It's the most depressing place. There's a few people in there, and they're all eating by themselves. All right, it was like at the famous case of LBJ when he was trying to get the civil rights bill. He would call up congressmen, and they'd say, "Well, listen, we need to talk." And they'd say, "I've been over there 3 times. I got to go home. Do you understand, Mr. President?" And LBJ would be driving up to the Capitol to see them. Mm-hmm. So,
but
that's
Dave, I'll tell you a depressing story about that. I was talking to a Democratic congressman once, and I asked him that same question. I said, "You guys eat lunch together anymore? Like, do you have any Republican friends? Do you guys go bowling together?" Right?
Yeah.
It's unlikely that they would go bowling. But I asked him, he said, "Are you kidding me? I don't have time to eat lunch with Democrats." He said, "If my staff caught me eating lunch, they'd grab me by the ear, put me in a room to dial for dollars. Because we have to spend at least 50% of our time, but oftentimes more, begging people for money, okay? We don't have time to eat lunch with Republicans or Democrats." That's the state they're in.
Yes, but when you're on the House floor or the Senate floor, you do have time to be cordial, and you do have time to actually, again, our theory is let's focus on things that we agree on, okay? And then we can get some common sense stuff passed. That will start to build a foundation of trust. How can you do business with someone when you not only dislike them and you demonize them, but you don't trust them? You can't do it. So I'm saying we need a foundation.
So one fun thing we found out from this interview is you are a Republican and we do disagree. Okay, so that's good. And it's okay to have but you're
absolutely.
Genuine. And so we're having a real conversation and we're finding out where we agree and where we disagree, which is what you want to do, which is great, and which is what I want to do as part of the Young Turks. Dave, the part I disagree with on what you just said is, they do agree oftentimes. Like, for example, in the trade deal that you talked about. Now, so why do they agree? The Democrats and Republicans agreed and they passed that bill.
No, actually, it was the Republicans that got that bill passed. Nancy Pelosi went on the floor and opposed it. So that was
I agree. But
a reverse example, so that's not an example of that.
No, but they passed it because they got enough Democratic votes and enough Republican votes, and President Obama, who's a Democrat, was in favor of it.
And that was the first time, by the way, that he sucked it up and went up to Capitol Hill and schmoozed.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons that bill also passed.
No, here's the real reason why that bill passed. It passed because all of the money was behind the bill. The corporate money was behind the bill. The wealthy and the powerful were behind the bill. So that is the one time Republicans and Democrats agree. Well, we agree the rich and the powerful should win.
Republicans are pro-trade, and that's one of the main problems I have with Democrats is they're pro-union. And so
no.
Yeah, so that's
Dave,
where
that's
all right. Well,
so that's not fair. It is partly true.
It's not. It's like about 80% true at least.
So yes, Democrats get money from unions. By the way, if I had it my way, and we have a whole pack to defeat all the other packs to get money out of politics. It's called Wolf Pack. If I had it my way, I wouldn't let the unions put in a dime into politics. I don't want the unions bribing the politicians anymore. Right. I want corporations bribing the politicians. I don't want anybody bribing them. I want democracy, right? So do the unions have a lot of sway with the Democratic Party? Yes. They used to have actually a lot more sway, but now corporations give more to the Democrats than unions do, so the unions have lost some power, or I would say significant power within the Democratic Party.
Well, and you look at the percentage of the workforce that's unionized now. See, my thing is that I'm split on unions. I think private sector unions are very important because it's basically a mutually assured destruction thing, right? If they beat up the company too much, the company goes out of business, everyone loses. It's public sector employees that should never have been allowed to unionize because the government's not going out of business and it's the fox watching the hen house, all right? They bribe these people that give them the most. And the worst was in California when Gray Davis was elected in 1999, he took office and he gave the unions a 20 or 30% boost in their pension. Now, granted, the NASDAQ was going up 83% that year, but they didn't need it. But the worst thing was that CalPERS said, oh, don't worry. No one has to sacrifice. We'll just make our projections more rosy. We'll assume 8% instead of 4%. Any responsible pension manager will tell you that if you're paying out, 4% is being generous. And the difference between 8% and 4% over 30 years is 68%.
Yeah.
So
I understand that.
That's why all these states are having these pension crises. So private sector unions I support, public sector unions I do not.
So public sector unions are an interesting case, and I think that we could probably come to a reasonable agreement on that. I don't necessarily agree with your position wholeheartly here, but I understand the case that you're making.
Right.
And so, for example, cops are a public sector union, right?
Right.
And their union is so strong, their pensions are unbelievable in the tri-state area, et cetera, and oftentimes they're above the law. Okay,
right.
So I get the issues. I get why public sector is different than private sector, and those are the reasonable conversations we can have. But at the same time, when you say Republicans are pro-trade, no, I used to be a Republican,
right?
And that's why this is an interesting conversation because you and I went in a slightly different direction.
Right.
I saw some of the same problems you saw, and I thought, well, why bother staying in this party? It turns out they're not for fiscal responsibility, and you go down the list, and they didn't do any things they promised. The last Republican president to balance the budget was Eisenhower, right?
Over the last 35 years, when has the budget deficit, public employment, and spending gone up under Republican administrations?
That's right.
One thing I will never forgive Ronald Reagan for, though he did a lot of great things, most importantly, he got us off the defensive as a country for the first time since the Vietnam War. He won the Cold War, though he could have done it a lot more cheaply. But he was the first president that got us living beyond our means. We never used to run a deficit in this country unless it was wartime. And David Stockman admitted later just how egregiously phony all those numbers that they supported were. And then you had Bush that came in, and the same type of thing. I'm someone who believes overall you want lower taxes and lower spending, though. The Grover Norquist say you can never raise taxes. Sometimes you have to raise taxes. Sometimes you have to raise spending. I think, for example, the stimulus plan should have been a little bigger that Obama came through, and half of it was $880 billion. Half of that was tax cuts. Yeah. So I think it should have been. And the infrastructure. I mean, the construction industry had a 14% unemployment rate. Interest rates are practically zero. The government can borrow money for free. It builds something that lasts, and it spreads the wealth across the country. And we did nothing.
Yeah. So there's so much we agree and disagree on, and it's good. That's a good, fruitful conversation. I can't help but say one last political point, and then I want to talk about your background a little bit.
Sure.
So on the pro-trade, I'm pro-trade. I think almost everybody is pro-trade. The question is, how do you do it? And I think at this point, that the bill that we're discussing, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it says that corporations are allowed to supersede national law. That's giving away our sovereignty. So they can go in and say, I'm going to take you to an international tribunal because you say I can't dump this toxin into your river. Well, that impedes my profits. And so if you're impeding my profits, I can take you to an international court. That is preposterous.
Well,
I'm pro-trade, but I don't want you dumping stuff into my river, and I can't control it through my democracy.
There's no bill that is perfect. I mean, sometimes we can get into healthcare. It's a whole other thing. But with the trade bill, overall it was a good bill. It involved 40% of the world's economy. And I think if we had not passed it, it would have reinforced this reputation that we have deservedly been getting around the world is that we're just not in control anymore. That we can't manage.
The ironic thing is we're not in control anymore. The corporations are.
I agree with you but at least there is an international tribunal. There is a body that would rule on that.
Shouldn't Republicans hate that they gave away sovereignty to an international tribunal?
Well, but again, trade is more important. You know, there are problems with almost every bill. I can't think of one bill that I've ever seen that I said, oh my God, this is a perfect bill. But my goal is if 80 or 90% of it is good, then you deal with the 10 or 20% that's bad, because overall you're going to have a much more of a net positive.
So we can go back and forth on all these issues all day, which would be fun.
I hope so. I'm really enjoying this conversation. It's fun.
Yeah. So again, I want to get into why you like politics and got into it and stuff. So where did you grew up in New York, right?
I grew up in Manhattan.
Was most of the Rockefeller family in Manhattan?
Yes, I'd say most of us live around New York. But it's an interesting thing because it's shifted by generation. For example, my grandfather's generation, even though Nelson was the quintessential Rockefeller Republican.
It's named after him.
Named after him, right?
Yeah.
Was tended to be more conservative. Then the next generation, I think part of it was mostly women, and there was a lot of rebellion against the Rockefeller name and embarrassment and all that. They're very liberal. I'm fifth generation. We're kind of middle of the road. There's some of us that are conservative, some of us that are more liberal. But so the family's really gone all over the place. And I think that's one of the great things about our family is that we're very diverse. We have very different views, but we get together a couple times a year. We really,
do you? I don't know.
Yeah, we really keep in touch, and I have 6 cousins on my dad's side and 280 on my mom's side. So the family has gotten pretty big. We're already up to the 7th generation now.
So I got to ask, because everybody in the audience has got to be wondering, is there still enough Rockefeller money for the 286 cousins?
Well, the interesting thing is that's one of the things I'm most proud of about our family is that the way the money was set up was through these original trusts that were established because the tax laws were going to be changed. And so it's the money can pass tax free until what's called the termination beneficiary, who is the last person, the youngest person alive when the trust was created. So there's a big difference in the amount of money. Nobody's starving, okay? But there's a huge gap in what some people have and other people have, and I think that's one of the things that makes me most proud is that we deal with that well, and despite our differences, and money is one of them. Some people are more wealthy, some people are more liberal or more conservative, but we all, when we're a family, we really focus on being a family. And again, I think that's part of my inspiration for Practically Republican. We always talk about, what can we do positively, not, who's got more money or who's got a better deal or anything like that. So I think we're a remarkably close family when you consider the circumstances that could tear us apart.
I read all those horror stories about by the time you get to the 3rd generation, let alone the 5th generation, like the Duke family, they had this huge fortune in North Carolina. I read
good old tobacco money.
Yeah, that's right. And by the 3rd generation, they're all like horrible, dysfunctional families, heroin addicts, etc. So, is there a branch of the Rockefeller family that's like, oh, they got hit by that?
I'm proud to say we have had remarkably few people really screw up. I mean, we had one person who did, unfortunately, die of a drug overdose. But overall, I think because we are a family that just has good values, and I was lucky to have 2 great parents who, my dad taught me the important things about etiquette and being a gentleman, and how you need to have a good vocabulary and you need to dress a certain way and present you a certain way. And my mom is, the most moral, most ethical person I know. I mean, she's the kind of person that would walk a mile to return $1. But she did something that was very smart, is that she really got us interested in philanthropy when we were at a young age. And so she set up a trust that at the age of 18, but we weren't going to get the principal. And I believe, certainly I don't have kids, but if I do, that they shouldn't get money till they're 35. Because most people get it at 21, that's too young. Even 25, 35, you've been out of college for more than 10 years, you have to support yourself, establish yourself. So she set up this trust, but so for the first 17 years, 6% of the original principal had to go to charity. And part of the deal was that I didn't just have to choose the charities, well, I didn't choose them, but I would recommend them, but I would have to actually go and visit them and see. And we gave to like in big league basketball for inner cities and some environmental organizations and some voting rights organizations. And so that really got me interested in philanthropy. It's kind of like, hey, you be a philanthropist for 17 years, and then there's some money waiting for you at the end of the rainbow there.
That is an excellent.
Yeah, and I would seriously, anyone who's wealthy who's watching this, I think it's a great idea because it incentivizes your kids to get to become philanthropic, and that's one of the greatest things that we have in this country.
And it's not just about philanthropy; it's also gets you to care about other human beings,
right?
Which is actually, and honestly, I know some wealthy folks in my life, and some earn their wealth throughout their lives and careers, and some were born into it. And it's honestly harder if you're born into it. And unless your parents work really hard at it, it's hard not to feel entitled and be used to the money, right?
Well, yeah, and I think that was true. Somewhat in my case, I don't think I ever felt entitled. But I did feel that I was going to live a charmed life because, I was born into this family. And then when I had my accident at 19, I think that was, obviously it's a terrible thing and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. But it really makes you appreciate things. It gives you a clarity. You don't take things for granted. You lose any smugness or entitlement that you have and you're just happy to be around, and you realize things like, money and is really just an amplifier or a means. Your relationships and your experiences, that's your soul. That's what you take with you. And that's one of the reasons I love to travel so much, because I think seeing amazing parts of the world with people you care about, nothing's better. Except maybe talking about politics.
No, that's the other thing's probably slightly better. So you lost your leg in the accident, right?
Yeah, I lost my right leg above the knee. The technology has improved. Sadly, but not surprisingly, the only time that prosthetic technology improves is during wartime.
Yep, that makes sense.
They didn't even have a hydraulic knee until the Vietnam War. And then with Iraq and Afghanistan, they've come out with computerized knees. I have the second generation computerized knee, which really gets me around well. The foot picks up naturally. So before I was always swinging it out a little bit, and now it's more of a step over step thing. And it really, this is the first leg I've had that it feels like a true extension. And and also I think for me, body care and good health is not an option. That's why I opened the wellness center, because if I gain weight, my leg's not going to fit. And I have to stay in top shape to lead a normal, energetic life and travel a lot and start projects like this. So for me, it's not a choice.
That makes sense. So finally, let's go full circle back to politics. So was it sitting around the campfire at the Rockefeller retreat, or the family retreat, I should say, because there's a lot of you. Your last name is Spencer, and obviously the family grows and grows and brings in a lot of new people. Where you've got Jay Rockefeller, who's a Democrat from West Virginia. Was that a topic that was discussed all the time? Nelson Rockefeller obviously being a big part of the family, or did that just you happen to be born interested in that topic?
I think actually, to be honest with you, Cenk, it was a combination of the two, because my uncle is more liberal than I am, but he really cared about policy, and he took an incredible amount of heat a few years ago when he got up and gave a speech to the West Virginia Joint Chambers and said, "Look, we can bury our head in the sand and pretend that coal is going to be around, or we can adjust to the new economy. Coal is dying." And you hear people talk about all these jobs that have been lost. Well, they haven't been lost because coal's not being used. They've been lost because the coal mining industry has cut the jobs through automation and efficiency. So he, unfortunately, his successor, Shelley Moore Caputo, who is, and by the way, we always used to tease Jay because I think he was the first West Virginia governor in, I don't know, like 10 that wasn't indicted or convicted of something.
Well, he didn't need the money, so that helps.
Yeah, so he, but he would really stick up for things that that he believed in, and I honor that. I think that's one of the most sacred and unfortunately these days rarest qualities in politics is when you hear people stand up for things because they really believe it's the right thing to do, not because they're being influenced by outside sources. And so I think that I really admired him in that. So, but to answer your question, I think it was a combination of that. But ever since I was a kid, I was always interested in politics. I majored in it in college, and I just became more and more of a junkie. And particularly after the 2010 election, when the Tea Party, which I think is probably the worst thing that ever happened to the Republican Party, because our system is based on compromise. And to the Tim Huelskamps of the world, compromise is treason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's all about purity. And again, politics, our founding fathers designed the system to require compromise. This is not a parliamentary system, right? So that's one of the reasons why. And part of that is, look, even Jimmy Carter didn't have as bad a relation with Congress as Barack Obama. So again, I think if Obama had made more of an effort, I think that's why governors make much better presidents than senators. Obama, by the way, trivia, is only the third senator to go straight from the Senate to the White House. JFK and then Chester A. Arthur, who was one of the worst presidents in history, were the only other two. And so governors make better presidents because they've run governments.
So I'm left at the end here wondering whether I should root for you or not. Because on the one hand, you're, more practical and moderate and reasonable. But on the other hand, if the Republicans listen to you, they might win more. And so I don't think I want them winning more.
But if they listen to me, that means that they would actually change their views and change their policies, and they might get
but
back.
But there's still plenty I disagree with you on that I don't want you to win on.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. But for example, I think a candidate who even someone who wasn't overly progressive could support would be someone like John Kasich, the governor of Ohio.
Yep, I hear you.
He was chairman of the Budget Committee. He was on the Armed Services Committee. He was reelected last year by 31%. And what I like about him, in addition to the fact that he is as close to a compassionate conservative, which is usually an oxymoron.
Yep.
And that's why I always say I'm a Republican. I'm not a conservative. But he talks about, again, even in that first debate, he was like, yeah, I took the Medicaid money. We got 10,000 drug addicts help. We got 11,000 mentally ill people, the help that they needed. He's talking about what we can do positively. And he came from a very modest background. And he's someone, I think, that could be the kind of Republican president that could get stuff done because people like him, and he's not overly partisan, he's not overly conservative, he's not strident. So he's someone, for example. Now, I mean, a lot of the other candidates, and I always predicted that Scott Walker was going to flame out because he wasn't ready for prime time, and that's happened. But again, for example, sometimes if you compare states, for example, it's always California versus Texas. I think the best comparison is Minnesota versus Wisconsin. All right, you had Mark Dayton, who's a pretty liberal governor, though I should say he was married to my aunt for a while. But he's someone who raised some taxes, cut others, put money into education. Minnesota has done better on almost every metric. Wisconsin is 38th in job creation. They have this huge budget deficit. The thing that gets me most, and this is one thing that we will agree on, is they say insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different result. And if you cut top marginal tax rates by less, or raise them by less than 10%, the effect is negligible. Okay, JFK cut them from 91 to 70. That had an effect. Reagan cut them from 70 to 50. That had an effect. Clinton raised them from 31 to 39.6, and we had the biggest boom in history, right? And so right now, you're looking at Bush, who then came in with a straight face and said, I'm going to cut them from 39 to 39.6 to 35, and it was a $2 trillion waste of money. So what I would do
right.
And frankly, I want to hear people talk about entitlements, because that's what's going to bankrupt the country. Do you know that if you take away entitlements and military spending, how much of the budget every year do you think is discretionary?
Oh,
16%.
It's a tiny amount. Yes.
Tiny amount.
Yes.
So it's entitlements, right? So I would, if I were a John Kasich, I would come in and I would offer middle-class tax cuts, because working-class whites are a very big part of the Republican Party, which in some ways is counterintuitive, because the policies of the Republican policy of the party have been so inimical towards so many of these people. But I would offer middle-class tax cuts, which first of all work, because again, right, I'm a pragmatist. If you allow people with a lot of money to keep more of it, they spend some of it. If you allow people with little or no money to keep more of it, they spend all of it, right? I mean, this is not rocket science. That would give you a legitimate reason to reform entitlements, because you can say, look, we're going to give you a short-term rebate here for a short-term cut in the programs to save them in the long run.
Okay.
So that would be a great great policy.
We're back to disagreeing.
Okay. Which is good. See, I enjoy conversations more where we disagree than when we agree.
Right. So
I think
that would take another...
I think fundamentally we're in the right place and we share the common goals. It's just our roots of getting there are a little different.
That's right. That's right. And the Social Security Medicare conversation would be another 20-minute conversation. But I'll leave it at everybody check out practicallyrepublican.com and find out whether you agree or disagree, right? Give it a fair shot. And no matter what you think of Dave's politics, agree or disagree, I think we all can agree on your views on charity and philanthropy. And as a homeless guy where I used to live in New York used to say to me, you don't have to be a Rockefeller to help a fella. So that could be your takeaway from this interview. Dave, thanks for so much.
God, it's been great. I really have had a great conversation. And you know, the key I always say, and why I enjoy doing this so much, is that with me, it's never personal, right? I will attack someone's ideas, but I will never attack them. Because, and in your case, I think we agree on some stuff, we disagree on some stuff, but we've obviously thought a lot about it. Yep. And we're passionate about it, and so both sides, I think, are worthy of respect on that.
I hope the country can have more conversations like this. Thank you,
And
Dave.
as we always say in Practically Republican, let's talk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.